So join me now in welcoming Matt Levendusky.
Great. Thanks so much for having me out. I don't know what it says about, I'll start with one little strange anecdote. I don't know what this says about American politics, but someone asked me to do a radio interview this morning. And I said, well, I can't do it. I'm going to give this talk. And they said, oh, don't worry. We'll just have you on the next time there's a political crisis in America. It was just offered as this very kind of casual observation, so I'm not, take from that what you will. So thanks so much for having me out and for the very generous introduction. I want to talk today about a couple of different aspects of American politics connected to polarization. So I want to start by just saying something sort of definitionally about polarization and sort of what it is. We'll talk a little bit about elite polarization, and then we'll use that as a segue to talk about what's happened in the electorate. We'll talk a little bit about the concept of voter sorting, and we'll end and spend the last part of the talk talking about how partisan media outlets, I think, contribute to this process as well. I think it's just good at the beginning. Lots of people use the term polarization, and I think they tend to mean slightly different things by it. So I think it's useful just to begin with a definition. So I think when we say that Democrats and Republicans are now more polarized than they were, say, in the 1950s or 60s, what do we really mean? And I think it means two different things, and we can illustrate that by looking at two graphs. Just do that. Right. So this is an example of what a moderate, more moderate electorate might look like. Right. So let's think that Republicans are given by the red line and the Democrats are given by the blue line. This is just sort of hypothetical data. And you notice that both parties have something of a more moderate ideology, right? And there's quite a bit of overlap between the two parties, right? So there are people sort of in the middle, right? So there are some. Okay, maybe that doesn't work. There are some sort of more conservative Democrats and some more liberal Republicans. Right, so there's a little bit of crossover between the parties. Right, there's some overlap. Thanks. Right, so we have, so both parties are a little bit more moderate, and there are people here sort of in the middle. So there's some crossover between them, right? But in contrast, in a more polarized electorate, yes. Well, let's see if we take that out. We'll just work without the pointer. No big deal. Right, in a more polarized electorate, notice right that the parties have moved sort of further, closer to the extremes, and there's now very few people here sort of in the middle. Right? So you can think about, and when I talk about polarization, I think about having those two components, right? One is a shift in sort of the average ideology between the parties, and the second is the sort of that overlap, or the other way to think about it is the internal homogeneity of the parties, right? So, before there were a lot of conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans. If you think back to like the 1960s, right, you had people like Richard Russell. Or the guy who was chairman, Wilbur Mills, in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, you have people like Jacob Javits, right? Today there aren't so many of those people, right? Now that's not to say that Chuck Schumer is the same person as Mark Begich or anything like that, but there's less sort of ideological span in the parties, right? And we can see this right at the elite level pretty clearly, and it's not very controversial. I think everyone agrees that the elite level, the parties are now more divided than they used to be, right? So to show you one quick example of this, so what we have here is a measure of ideology for members of Congress that's taken from their roll call votes, right? And so Republicans are in red and Democrats are in blue. And so this is the 88th Congress, which is when a lot of key pieces of Great Society legislation were passed. So, for example, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, right? And you notice that sort of the average Democrat sort of over here, right? The average Republicans over here, they're not that far apart, right? The blue kind of gets lost behind here, but there's sort of a tail of more conservative Democrats. There's some liberal Republicans, right? So that seems to have both of those things we saw in the same moderate graph earlier, right? The parties are pretty close to the center. There's a little bit of, at least some overlap between them. If we were to fast forward to today, right, we have near complete separation of the parties, right? So notice that the average Republican, the average Democrat are sort of further out, right? And there's not really anyone left in the middle, right? So this is the Congress that just finished up in January, right? So we see in this graph, right, no overlap, further apart, right? And, you know, using votes is sort of a convenient way of doing this. So political scientists like to do it because, you know, we have a lot of voting data over time. We could do other things, right? Other people have looked at campaign contributions, or they've, you know, sort of analyzed speeches and stuff, and you get the same basic patterns, right, of data. And we could do this for other types of political elites as well, right? The overall message seems to be that at the elite level, right, so people who are sort of elected politicians, they're now more divided than they were, you know, a generation ago. And there's a lot of reasons for why this is the case. I'm not going to talk a ton about them today. Instead, what I want to do is say, you know, I want to talk to you about what are some of the consequences of this, right? And so, you know, one potential consequence of this is that ordinary voters might become more divided, right? And so, right, we could sort of think, well, as elites become more divided, ordinary voters become more divided. And there's been a lot of attention to this over the past, say, 10 or 12 years. And so this leads to sort of an obvious question. What would happen if we looked at ordinary Americans and did a similar sort of analysis, right? Will we see the same sort of movement? And unfortunately, although there's a lot of survey data, it actually turns out there's not a lot of survey data over time where people ask the same questions. And the reason why asking the same questions is important is you need the same questions to be asked over time, because otherwise you don't know if people's responses are changing because their, you know, sort of underlying ideology is changing, or they're changing because the question itself is changing, right? And so there was a famous case in the 1970s where people said, oh, look, there's been this big change in voters, when it turned out the big change they discovered was just that they had changed the way they asked a few questions, and that had actually changed people's responses. So about the best we can do is we can look from the mid-'80s up to the present, and we can say, well, how has the distribution of sort of preferences changed in the American electorate over that time? And if we do that, sorry, the graph is a little bit hard to see. The sort of solid line is the distribution of ordinary voters in 1984. This dashed line is the distribution in 2004, right? And so you can see they're actually pretty similar. And I apologize, I accidentally left it out. I was editing the presentation yesterday before I left. But you could see that if we did that same plot we did earlier with Democrats and Republicans, we wouldn't see a whole lot of movement there either, and we'd still see a lot of overlap there as well. I'll show you a very similar plot in a minute. Right, so, you know, I think you can see here there's a little bit of change, right? In 2004, there's a little bit, people are a little bit less likely to be in the center and a little bit more likely to sort of be slightly off-center. And we'll get to why that's the case in a minute, or in a few minutes. But overall, right, it still seems like there's still a fair number of people in the middle, and there's not so much, right, people aren't quite so much at the end as they were on the sort of elite distribution. Right? So it suggests that there's not necessarily a straight line. We can sort of say, well, because elites are polarized, the mass public has followed suit, right? Most people seem to still be pretty moderate, right? And so if you've read any of the work of one of my mentors, Mo Fiorina, he's done a lot, you know, looking at this. It seems to be that there, you know, if you look at the vast majority of Americans, most people are still relatively moderate. But that's not to say unchanged in any way. We'll see in a few minutes, they've actually changed in a pretty important way. So one thing you might ask, and seeing that, you might say, okay, well, yeah, if you kind of lump everyone together, you know, you see this sort of moderation, right? But what happens if you look maybe at people in red states and blue states, right? Maybe people in a blue state like Pennsylvania or Washington, they're just really different than people who live in, say, Utah or Montana, right? So maybe there you see bigger differences, right? And we're all familiar with these sorts of graphs, right? So here, red, the dark red means Republicans carried it in all 4 elections between 2000 and 2012. Light red means they carried it in 3 of the 4. Purple means they carried it in 2 of the 4. Light blue means they carried it in 1, and dark blue means the Democrats took it every time. Right? So people look at these sorts of graphs and they say, look, places like Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, Utah, they're very different from, California, New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts. Right? So, one of my co-authors and I were really interested in this question. So 2 years ago, we did a study where what we said was, okay, well, let's get a lot of data where we can actually look at the opinions of people in red states and blue states. And let's just see what their opinions look like. So we took surveys and we kind of took ones where there were a lot of questions asked of people across a wide variety of issues. And then we just said, what does the distribution of ideology look like in red and blue states? And so when we do that, you get a picture like this. So it's a little bit confusing. Let me walk you through it. I think it looks confusing at first. It's actually a pretty simple message. So we could do a lot of different comparisons. We took just what in this election were the sort of 2 most partisan states. So New York was the most Democratic state. Utah was the most Republican state. And so what we did was we said, let's take people, so the economics plus dimension means people's attitudes on things like taxes, spending, those sorts of things. And social issues are your classic sort of, cultural issues, moral issues, abortion, gay marriage, school prayer, those sorts of things. And so we said, let's just plot the distribution of them, right? So the people from New York are the solid blue line. The people on the dashed red line are the people from Utah, right? And so if you notice, right, in this graph, yes, right, the average, voter in New York is a little bit more liberal than the average voter, somewhere around there, in Utah, right? So there's a difference, but the difference isn't enormous. And the other important thing to notice is notice how much overlap, right, there is. Right? There are quite a few conservative New Yorkers, and even, despite what you might think about Utah, right, there are some people who are more liberal, right? And the same thing happens over here, right? While, the sort of modal Utahn, I guess that's how you'd say that, is Ute, modal Ute, is, somewhat more, conservative on these social issues, right? There's still plenty of people who are pretty liberal, right? And while there's, the average New Yorker is quite liberal, right, there's still quite a few people who are relatively conservative, right? And so New York and Utah here we just use as exemplars. You could pick any other, if you're interested in, I don't know, or looking for a way to go to sleep and you want to read the rest of the paper, and you can see we do a whole bunch of different comparisons in different kinds of states. You can pool people into different categories. It doesn't really seem to make a big difference, right? That in these red and blue states, that yes, there is a difference in partisan preference between New York and Utah, right? But there's still quite a lot of overlap, right? And again, we're still sort of suggesting that people are a little bit more towards the middle. So I think that this underlines, right, that for a lot of Americans, not all Americans, but for a lot of Americans, right, their preferences look a little bit different, right, than, say, Dick Durbin and Ted Cruz, right? The elite's preferences are more divided than ordinary voters' preferences. But you might think, well, isn't this a little bit, sort of silly, right? We see that there are, people, protesting, protesting Obamacare, protesting the budget shutdown, protesting Keystone XL, right? Aren't there people in the country who are more divided, right? And I think there's sort of 2 points to keep in mind, right? One, people who engage in political protest aren't representative of the broader public. That those people tend to be people who are more activist, right? They're more active, they're more interested, they're more committed, they're more committed to political causes. So their views, right, aren't necessarily the views of ordinary Americans. And, this is, I think, one of the sort of fundamental quandaries of democratic politics, that the people whose voices are often the loudest are often the least representative of what ordinary people want, right? In part because the whole reason you would go out and give your time to go to a protest and do these things is that you care so deeply and so passionately about these things, right? So that's an important point to keep in mind, that the people we see being most involved are very, very rarely representative of ordinary Americans. And second, there is an important change that even ordinary voters have undergone over the past generation, right? And that's a change that I've called voter sorting in some of my work. So what does voter sorting mean? So I think about sorting as the alignment of partisanship and ideology, so that Democrats, ordinary Democrats, right, have not necessarily become a lot more liberal, right, but they've changed so that before maybe they were kind of more moderate in the middle, but now they've moved maybe a little bit in the liberal direction. And Republicans, right, from before maybe being in the middle, have moved a little bit in the conservative direction, right, which is kind of consistent with that graph we saw earlier, where there are fewer people right in the middle, more people a little bit off to one side or the other, right? And so we can think about an example of this if we think about, say, the issue of abortion, right? In the early 1970s, right, think about the time that Roe v. Wade was being decided. I know many of you in the room were not alive then, but for those of you who were, you know, you can think back that at the time, right, the Democratic Party didn't look quite so much like it did today, right? There was still a big base of the Democratic Party that was working class, as they were called at the time, ethnic voters, which basically means Poles, Czechs, Italians, Slovaks, those sort of folks, right? These were people who were predominantly Catholic, predominantly working class, more culturally conservative, right? These were not people who were generally supportive of abortion rights. And the other big part of the Democratic coalition at that point was people from the South, again, traditionally not very supportive of abortion rights. And if you think about Republicans at the time, right, the Republicans at the time were actually slightly more supportive of abortion rights because it was sort of a country club Republican type of position, you know, in the early 70s. But that really all changed, right, in the late 70s and 80s, right, when the parties sort of split on that, right? And so that happens in large part because the Republican Party sort of strategically starts to recruit evangelicals and people from the religious right. Democrats sort of respond by trying to strategically mobilize people who are more secular and on the left, right? So the elite parties begin to diverge on the issue, and over time, ordinary voters kind of follow suit, right? And the end result isn't that, you know, now every, you know, ordinary Democrat is pro-choice and every ordinary Republican is pro-life, right? There are still, you know, pro-choice Democrats and pro-life Republicans, right? I'm not claiming that. It's just that on average now, if you look, Democrats are more likely to be pro-choice, Republicans are more likely to be pro-life. And it's not just on that one issue of abortion, right? It's on a lot of other issues. So if you look at things like taxes, spending, you know, support for, you know, health reform, right? These sort of issues where the parties have taken a clear position, right? Ordinary voters have now sort of aligned themselves better. So just give you one example of this. This question only begins in 1980. Unfortunately, they changed the wording then. I think it's actually 82. But this is some survey data going through 2004. And you can see this is sort of the percentage of Democrats who are pro-choice and the percentage of Republicans who are pro-life. And you can see that over time, right, there's been sort of an upward trend. If we were to add 2008 and 2012, we'd see it went up a little bit more, not a tremendous amount, right? So over time, we've seen people sort of adopt the position of their parties. And just one quick sort of caveat on this. Sometimes when I give these presentations to, you know, different groups, people say that people will say, well, you just think voters are stupid and they don't, you know, all they can do is kind of blindly follow what elites say. And that's not what I'm trying to say at all. Actually, voters are pretty smart, right? What this is, the way I think about this is sort of a decision-making heuristic, right? Abortion maybe isn't the right way to think about this, right? Let's take a step back and think about, you know, sort of a new issue, right? You know, and maybe there's some new issue that comes onto the scene, right? And so you say, well, I don't know what to think about, you know, this new issue, but I know that, you know, I've agreed with Nancy Pelosi or I've agreed with, you know, Ted Cruz in the past. So what they think now is likely to be a pretty good guess about what I'm going to think on this new issue, right? It's sort of complicated. Maybe I don't, you know all of the details. So I can take sort of a shortcut and just sort of say this person sort of shares my values and I've agreed with them in the past, so it's likely that I'll agree with them on this issue. Now, maybe once you found out more about the issue, you wouldn't agree with them, right? And people are sort of smart enough to know how to do that. But on average, right, when new things come up, right, people tend to sort of look to their party elites, right, because those are the people in the past, right, who they've said, well, they kind of share my values, I tend to agree with them, so it's likely that I'll agree with them on this issue as well, right? So that has led, so this sort of voter sorting, right, has led to, I think, some important changes. And I think this sort of helps to explain why even if people aren't much more divided, politics can feel much more divisive. So in my first book, I looked at some of the consequences of this, and there's been a very nice study by a new PhD from the Stony Brook University who sort of followed up on some of that work. And what I found and what her work is sort of built on is showing that this really makes people sort of more committed to their side of the aisle, right? So even if now, you're not much more, say you're a Democrat, you might not be, very far to the left, but you're more like the Democrats are my guys and my girls, right? So I'm going to be much more likely, if I'm a sorted Democrat, to vote for them in elections. So I found that if you look at people before they were sorted and compare them to themselves after they sort, they're about 25 percentage points more likely to vote for their party's presidential nominee. And they're about 16% less likely to split their ticket. So splitting your ticket means you vote for like a Democrat for president and a Republican for Congress, right? They become much more distrustful of the other side, right? They like their own side more. They like the other side less. They will ascribe more negative features to the other side, so they think they're less trustworthy, less honest, right? They're more tolerant of uncivil behavior on their side and less tolerant of it on the other side, right? And the other thing that happens is they become somewhat less likely to compromise, right? So they are more, they say it's more important for their side to stand on principle. That's not to say that they say, never compromise, right? But they sort of move more in that direction. And we know that because one of the sources for elites is, knowing that ordinary voters want them to compromise or not, right? That has implications for people's willingness to compromise, right? So one of the reasons why people like Ted Cruz don't want to compromise, and even if you saw there's a nice article this morning, both in USA Today and the New York Times, right, where they both pointing out that Harry Reid, right, even in the past, he's been someone who's been more flexible, has been more inflexible here, and I think part of that is, sort of given away in both of those articles, as they said, people on both sides are saying, don't compromise, right? So that, sort of, even if people aren't necessarily as extreme as elites, they still sort of say, don't you compromise because the other side is wrong, right? Obamacare is evil and we need to get rid of it, or, we can't give in to Republicans because they're, just trying to overturn the results of the last election. Right? So hopefully that's at least a partial, it's not a complete explanation, but I think it's a partial explanation for how we can have more polarized elites with more moderate voters, right? But of course, this isn't the only thing that's changed, in particular over the past 10 or 15 years. One of the really interesting things that's happened is that we now have a whole variety of different media outlets that weren't there a generation ago. 20 years ago, no one had ever heard of Fox News, right? The internet was basically just this thing for academics to share data sets, right? And talk radio was sort of just in its infancy. But now, right, you can listen to all kinds of, especially conservative talk radio, but there's a small liberal talk radio audience as well for people like Randy Rhodes, right? If you're a conservative, you can flip on Fox News in the evening, or if you're a liberal, you can turn on MSNBC and you can watch, Sean Hannity and Bill O'Reilly, or, Chris Hayes and Ed Schultz and Rachel Maddow on MSNBC. And when you do that, right, you're getting a different sort of news. So, if you'd have turned on, to go back to someone who was from 20 years ago, Peter Jennings, right, on ABC News, right, in the 80s or 90s, he was sort of the classic, what political scientists and communication scholars call a broadcast journalist, right? So he was someone who tried to sort of be very fair and objective to both sides and sort of say, Democrats do this, Republicans do that, and sort of report things in a more neutral manner. But if you've ever watched someone like Bill O'Reilly, or especially Sean Hannity, or Rachel Maddow on the other side, they don't really do that, right? They're It's sort of news with a narrative, right? Sean Hannity makes no. One of the reasons I sort of like Hannity in a way, whether or not you agree with his politics, is that he makes no illusions about where he stands, right? He will tell you flat out, I am a conservative Reagan Republican, and that's the way I think we should govern the country. Right? And he's very critical of the president and very supportive of people in the Republican Party, especially more conservative Republicans. And likewise, if you watch Rachel Maddow, right, you know, to the extent that she criticizes Obama, it's for not being liberal enough. Right? And so, you know, I think we can see sort of the difference in these two sort of approaches by comparing the way one mainstream and one partisan outlet responded to a political decision President Obama made a few years ago, or not a few years ago, last year, when he announced that he was in support of same-sex marriage. Right? So here's how CNN, and this is their headline the day he did this, right? You know, Obama announces he supports same-sex marriage, right? And if you went on and read the story, it just sort of said, you know, it talked about, well, this is the first time a president's ever done this. You know, he's changed his position, you know, but it didn't really sort of take a point of view. It just sort of gave you the facts. Now, in contrast, a partisan source is going to cover this pretty differently, right? So here's Fox Nation is like the editorial section of FoxNews.com. Obama flip-flops, declares war on marriage. You know, and so these sort of examples, I think, illustrate the way in which these outlets are giving you the news from a particular point of view, right? It's not just the stories, but it's the stories filtered through a particular viewpoint, right? And if you already agree with this, right, this has some potentially troubling implications, because we know for some, you know, research in political science and social psychology that when people hear just hear their own view kind of echoed back at them, right, that can have some important implications. And so that's what my second book tries to wrestle with. And so I just want to very briefly kind of talk through some of the things that I found in doing that, because I think maybe they're a little bit illustrative for what's happening right now. So I asked whether partisan media polarizes people's attitudes, and whether it makes people dislike and distrust the opposition, and whether it makes them more willing to accept nefarious interpretations of elections, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. Right. So let's take this question of attitudes first. I think in some ways this is the most important one. So if you watch, you know, let's say you're a conservative Republican, and you know you one night sort of flip on Fox News and you start watching it. You know, does that make you more conservative? And there's some reason to think that it might, right? So say you watch Fox News and you're listening to them talk about, you know, the shutdown. So I went and watched a little bit of Fox, you know, the other night, and you know what they were sort of saying, at least on the first night. I didn't get a chance to watch them last night. Unfortunately, the airport was broadcasting CNN, just a little less. I was hoping I could convince them to turn on Fox, but they didn't know how to change the channel, or at least MSNBC. But you know, the thing they were saying a few nights ago, at least, was basically like, look, this isn't going to be that bad. You know, the government's too big. We should be trimming it anyway. This is just going to show people that they don't need, you know, everything the federal government does. It's too bloated and big, right? And if you turn on MSNBC, right, they were spinning a very different story, right? So they were talking a lot about, you know, the patients who'd been turned away from the NIH hospitals, right, the people who were involved in research trials, which now have to be, you know, some of them had to be suspended. Right, they were talking about kids who weren't able to go to Head Start and people who weren't able to get their SNAP benefits, which is what we now call food stamps. Right, so they were giving you very different takes on the same story. Right, and so we know that when people just hear their own, you know, things they already agree with, right. So if you're a Democrat who's watching MSNBC, right, it's probably pretty likely that you already agreed with them that it was a bad idea to shut down the government. Right, and if you're a conservative, chances are, and you're watching Fox, chances are you already agree with them that it wasn't so bad that we were going to shut down the government. And we know that when you just hear your own beliefs echoed back at you, right, that you sort of think, no, that's a good point. I really agree with that. That's right. Right, and when you hear that, right, it does two subtle things to you, right? It tends to push you a little bit more, right, away from the center, a little bit more towards a strengthening of your point of view on that issue. And the other thing it does is it makes you more certain of your views, right? Because you're like, yes, that's right. It really is right that, you know, we should do this or we shouldn't. And so what I found is that when you show people these segments, that's what happens, right? That people tend to both become more convinced that their own point of view is right, and they tend to move, not a lot, but a little bit more towards the extremes. But what's interesting is that this doesn't happen for people who are just who normally wouldn't watch these shows, right? Who aren't a regular part of the audience. But if you're the sort of person who already has these kind of viewpoints, right? Because we know people who watch Fox ex ante are more conservative, people who watch MSNBC ex ante are more liberal, right? So these people who already kind of agree with their side, right, are the ones who are most affected by these shows. So it's not, if we think back to those distributions of voter, sort of preferences earlier, it's not sort of shifting around the people who are in the middle. So it's not like someone's a moderate and they turn on Fox News and all of a sudden they're, conservative overnight. What happens is you're already a little bit conservative, you watch Fox, and now you become more conservative, right? So if we think about it, sort of elongating the tails rather than shifting the sort of middle part of that distribution, right? And what's really interesting is I sort of what I had hoped, right, and sort of the classic idea from democratic theory is that if you were a Democrat and you watched Fox, or you were a Republican and you watch MSNBC, right, you might moderate a little bit because maybe you think the other side has, well, I don't agree with them, but they've got like one or two good ideas, so maybe that's a good point. So maybe I don't believe that as strongly as I used to. But what happens is people just seem to basically reject the message from the other side. They just say, no, those people on Fox, they're just crazy. They don't have anything valid to say. And it doesn't really seem to move their points of view. So I'm doing some other follow-up work now with a co-author. We're trying to dig into that and understand that a little bit more. But that's not the only place where you might find an effect. How does this affect the way people feel towards the other side? Because after all, right, the way they talk about the other side is pretty stark on these shows, right? Now, this is obviously a pretty extreme example, but if you watch Fox, it's pretty clear. So Sean Hannity likes to call President Obama the anointed one, and he'll sometimes even jokingly call him the Messiah, right? Because he says Democrats just sort of worship Obama, they think he can't do any wrong, right? And if you watch the way, Rachel Maddow talks about Sarah Palin or about Michelle Bachmann, or Ted Cruz or Justin Amash, like any of those sort of big conservative people, right? She's sort of equally, like cutting about them. So it turns out that in the same way, if you're a kind of conservative and you watch Fox, or a liberal and you watch MSNBC, it does have consequences for how you view the other side, right? So it's the same sort of story, right? That if you sort of watch Fox News criticize Obama, you're like, yes, he is terrible. I don't like, what he does. He's not a good president. And if you're watching MSNBC, you think, God, those Republicans, they really are terrible, right? And the other thing that this does as a consequence is it makes you less likely to trust the other side, and it further undermines support for compromise and bipartisanship. Again, remember that it's not so much ordinary people watching this, but it's a sort of more small and selected audience. But the reason that it's that small and selected audience that matters is that these people are more likely to be those activists I talked about earlier, right? And even if they're not these sort of full-blown activists, right, they're people who are more politically involved and engaged. So these are the people who might, contact their member of Congress and say, don't you back down, right? You stand up and make sure that, our side wins, right? We can't give in to the other side because they're just wrong. So this then works to undermine, support for these sorts of things. Finally, there's one last sort of way, that this can affect politics, right? And that's in the way you interpret election outcomes. So it does have an effect on your vote choice, but again, that's maybe not quite so surprising, given what we said before. I think the more interesting thing is that I can only look at this in the 2008 case. It's the only one where we have enough good data to look at this. It'd be nice to be able to look at this in 2004. Unfortunately, we just don't have the data. So this is something I would put a little bit of an asterisk next to this finding. So if you watched Fox News in 2008, you were more likely to accept some what I think of as nefarious interpretations for Obama's victory. In particular, there were two that Fox pushed in 2008. The first was that Obama won because of vote fraud, right? That basically groups like Acorn and the Obama campaign registered lots of voters and they stuffed ballot boxes and they did things like this. And the second thing is that you're more likely to think he won because of media bias. Right, that is that the media were sort of in the tank for Obama all along, and so as a result, Obama, won because the media presented him in a good light and presented McCain in a bad light, right? And so again, this is sort of troubling because it sort of suggests that people, are willing to kind of take up these explanations, right? And once you believe that Obama's victory is illegitimate, you're more likely to think that, his policies are illegitimate as well. So, this, I think, helps to explain a way in which these shows can be sort of harmful, even if they only reach the sort of small audience, right? Because they're, introducing this sort of discourse and rhetoric that makes people less willing to compromise, right? Less willing to kind of meet the other side halfway, and to, introduce maybe a little bit more incivility into the political dialogue. So in the end, I sometimes step back and think, well, is polarization a good thing or a bad thing? And being a typical academic, I suppose, I'll equivocate a little bit. So the sort of bad thing aspect of it, I think, is sort of more obvious, right? It's what we've just been talking about, right? It's all these sorts of things that, give people, right, more reason to distrust the other side, to be less willing to compromise, right, to become more extreme, right, to be less willing to kind of meet in the middle, right? And I think one of the geniuses of American democracy and American system of government is a government that forces consensus, right? It's not a Westminster system where one party gets to kind of just assert its agenda. It's a system where you have to come together and reach a compromise solution in order to effectively govern. But on the other hand, there is a benefit to polarization, right? That's worth thinking about as well, right? And I don't know that in the end it outweighs all these other things, but there is a slight silver lining, let's say. Right? So one of the things it does do is it does help ordinary citizens to be able to sort of participate in politics more easily, right? So because voters have these kind of clearer signals, right, this works in two ways. On the one hand, you can sort of say, well, okay, I know what the parties, sort of stand for, and so I know, that if I choose the Democrats, we're getting this sort of policy, and if I choose the Republicans, we're getting this sort of policy, right? They do offer pretty different visions, right, for the way the country should be governed. Right? And that can also help people sort of align their own sort of preferences and beliefs. So to the extent that you think it's important for people to have some sort of coherent political beliefs, right, then this helps with that as well. Now, in the end, whether or not you think that's worth the trade-off of these other factors sort of depends on how you view all of these other things. And at one time it was maybe a little bit more ambivalent. Now I maybe tend to think polarization is on balance a bad thing. But I think it's important to recognize that there are both positive and negative features of it. So thanks so much for coming to hear me. I hope that was interesting.
So we have plenty of time for questions and answers. Maybe I'll start with a question. People who study elite polarization often talk about asymmetrical polarization. Republicans have become substantially more conservative.
Right.
Democrats a little more liberal. Do you see asymmetrical polarization in the media as well? Have you looked at that? Or?
I mean, it's a little bit tougher because getting the exact measure of polarization is a little bit tougher. I certainly think Fox News is it presents a more sort of coherent vision than MSNBC does. I mean, exactly quantifying the degree of bias on them is tough, but sort of. If I can make a sort of quasi-informed conjecture, I'd say it's probably a little bit more to the right than MSNBC is to the left. If you look at the way ordinary people respond to it, it's hard to pick up a partisan difference, but that could be in part just because it's very tough to get enough people to actually find that. That actually takes a really big sample to be able to find those differential partisan effects in that sort of data. So I always put a caveat on it like that. I mean, it's an interesting question, right? I think you can view it from one of two ways, right? One way is that you could sort of say, well, with more parties, you have to sort of form something, not necessarily like a coalition government, but there has to be a little bit more give and take between the parties, right? On the other hand, you can say, well, the sort of brilliance of a two-party system is that it forces the parties, right, to kind of balance out these sort of internal disputes, right? And I think in a lot of ways that's actually kind of what we're seeing in the Republican Party right now. Civil war is that's way too strong of a word, but we're seeing internecine squabble. Think of some less stark term, right? Between the sort of let's say party people and ideology people, right? So it's not that John Boehner's not a moderate guy, right? He's a pretty conservative Republican, but John Boehner is a Republican first, and I think a conservative second. What I mean by that is I think John Boehner wants to see the Republican Party do well, because I think he sees his agenda as being advanced by the Republican Party, right? And so lots of other people in the party, sort of say this. So if you've seen, there have been these sort of moves by I think 22 Republicans as of this morning who had said they would, in the House, who said they would vote for a so-called clean budget bill, right? One that does not demand stripping funding from Obamacare. And that's in contrast with, your sort of Phil Gingrich's, Justin Amash, Ted Cruz's of the world, who, I think are ideologues before they're partisans, right? So they would say, better to stand on principle and lose, right, than to win by kind of compromising what you stand for, right? And so now the bad part about this two-party system, right, is that then you have to kind of, it has negative consequences. Right now the government's basically shut down because these two sides can't, agree on what to do. But, it's a trade-off. It's not, because the other thing that happens when you have multiple parties is parties stake out these very particular ideological niches, and they tend not to be in the center, right? So they move. The typical story in a multi-party system is that parties move to these flanking moves and try to pick off people who are more extremes on the end. So I think it's not necessarily clear that with more parties we'd end up with more compromise.
What about the idea that the reason that Congress is more polarized than the electorate is because of gerrymandering, so that we don't really have a two-party system in individual districts? What's important is the primary, and therefore the politics of one party or the other is what's important in each district.
Great question. So this is something that comes up a lot. This is one of those big sort of surprise findings from political science. This seems like it's such an intuitive, sort of thing, right? But as best we can tell by looking at the data, gerrymandering itself doesn't seem to be the issue. And what I mean by that is, as odd as that sounds, right, that seems to be the more, it's an effect, but it's a more marginal effect. The much bigger effect is what we might think of as sometimes called T-bow sorting. And what that basically means is that people sort of self-segregate into different kinds of areas. And it's not that politics is not, it's pretty clear politics is not the driving factor behind that, right? It's these lifestyle factors that are correlated with politics, right? So it's that the type of people who tend to vote for Democrats want to live in places where there are yoga studios and Whole Foods and, organic groceries. And people who tend to vote for Republicans want to live in places where, there's lots of like open spaces and, land is somewhat cheaper and, there's like gun ranges and those sorts of things. It gives them very so I will just tell you that I had a friend who said he couldn't, I won't reveal what university it was, but he said, I can't take a job there. I mean, there's not even a yoga studio in the town, which I told him was not a valid reason for taking or not taking a job, but that's neither here nor there. So that is the way in which I think this is sort of a much tougher nut to crack, right? So gerrymandering contributes, but it's actually more on the margin, right? So if you think about a place like, Philadelphia, it's actually kind of hard to draw compact districts in a way that would make Philadelphia and its immediate suburbs, sorry, I'm still getting over a cold, pretty more competitive districts, because basically Philadelphia and the suburbs that surround it are pretty Democratic, and the suburbs sort of in the ring around that are pretty Republican. And that's a more typical pattern for a lot of cities, right? That it's actually difficult to draw, districts that meet the other standards that the Supreme Court has laid out that are more competitive, right? It seems to be there are these other factors that lead people to sort, and because those things are sorted with politics, it has those consequences. Not to say that gerrymandering reform wouldn't be worth doing, it would make a difference, but it wouldn't make as much of a difference as people tend to think it would.
What about Citizens United?
Another great question. One of the most interesting things about Citizens United, and let me just say that one of the reasons I'm very glad I don't study campaign finance is that the answer changes from election to election because the system, it evolves so much from one election to the next. So what we saw in 2012, I think one of the most interesting things, and this is now, I'm allowed to say this now because it's been said other places, so I got to go to a off-the-record debrief with the Romney and Obama campaign people after the election last year, and one of the things the Romney people said was Citizens United, by their own data, actually hurt them more than it helped them. And what do I mean by that? Right? So my view going into it and the way the media portrayed it was that this really helped them because they had all this extra money to spend, right, that these groups were spending on these ads, right? But the problem was because the groups couldn't coordinate the ads with the Romney campaign, couldn't coordinate their ads with the Romney campaign, they ended up drowning out the Romney campaign's message. So the Romney campaign had a particular message that they want to send that was not the same message as these groups sent. These other groups ended up drowning out the Romney message. And in fact, a lot of the ads that the Citizens United groups ran were ads that the Romney campaign had tested some variation of and knew didn't work. In fact, a couple of them they knew actually backfired and decreased support for Romney. So it actually didn't seem to help them very much. That's not to say that money in politics isn't a troubling thing. I think it is for a whole variety of other reasons, not least of all the sort of substitution effect that it makes members of Congress spend a lot of time raising money instead of actually legislating. That said, people may learn from that, and it may be much more troubling in 2016 and even 2014. And I think to the extent that Citizens United will have an effect, it's actually probably the biggest effect might actually be in these much smaller races. I think one of the fears was that they were going to be more active in the Democratic primary for New York mayor. They didn't seem to be this time around. But I think that's actually where we might see more of an effect. Because at the presidential level, right, there's so many messages that are kind of going. The typical finding in presidential elections is that messages from one side more or less cancel out with messages on the other, right? You're working for these very tiny effects on the margin, right? But in these smaller races where there's just sort of less going on, right, we could see more of an effect there. So I think the answer is it didn't seem to have been a huge effect, doesn't seem to have been a huge effect in 2012. It might be more of an effect in the future. We just don't know. Good question. I mean, I think news is just in this sort of fundamental shift, right? The whole economics of news is changing so much. It's really hard to know what it's going to look like in 20 years. There's just far fewer organizations that are willing to invest in or sort of able to invest in, large-scale, broad reporting in lots of places. I think that'll in some ways shape the future of this. I don't think this will become the dominant model of news anytime soon, but it does. I think in part that's because the dominant model of news will still be sell ads to the largest number of people, which means more kind of generic content that doesn't offend people. That said, the bigger issue is that young people. So if you watch, I don't watch that much. I have to admit, even I as a political scientist don't watch that much broadcast news. But if you watch broadcast news, it's actually it will make you feel really old because all the commercials are for like Centrum Silver, Geritol, the AARP. Like they figured out who their audience is. So the bigger question I think will be what happens on the internet and how, if newspapers and other outlets can figure out a proper way to kind of monetize that. The New York Times thing actually seems to be sort of working. They seem to be making money on that. So something like that might be more the future, some sort of combination paywall sort of system to, recapture some of that revenue. I think we just don't know. The future of journalism's really in flux.
To Citizens United, maybe you could talk a little bit about the impact of campaign contributions in Citizens United on polarization itself. So if you look at somebody like Sheldon Adelson, he was able to keep Newt Gingrich in the primaries much later than he should have been, which forced Romney further to the right than he wanted to go, and probably hurt his electoral chances, but
Yeah.
polarize the parties.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think that's another sort of place where we can sort of where we might see more of this is that it'll have more an effect in primaries, which are in a way sort of these not less salient, but the message effects are very different because there's not like a big one competing from the other side. And so I think it has a real potential to shake up those kinds of contests as well. Sure, and keep people who otherwise might not be able to stay in the race in there. Right? I don't think even Newt Gingrich ever really thought he had a chance to win. I think he was sort of playing a different game to kind of, I suspect for Newt Gingrich, without seeming sort of horribly cynical, I suspect that was largely a game to boost his speaking fees and his book sales. And I think for a lot of people, I don't even really know that Rick Santorum, it's unclear, maybe I think at a certain point thought he could win, but I think for a lot of them it's more about if I boost my profile, I can then sort of boost my money-making opportunities in the post-war. And not to be too cynical, I think part of the reason why someone like Sarah Palin didn't want to run is she realized there's a lot more money to be made, appearing on Fox News, speaking at these conservative conventions, doing book tours, doing appearances, than there is in being vice president or being a senator or even president, right? So I think that some of these people are playing a different game, but that's a great point that with this new sort of unrestricted money, right, it might change things. And shoot, I can't think of the guy's name. The case that goes before the Supreme Court on Tuesday, McCutcheon v. FEC, right? That could change things even further, right? If we change these aggregate limits on campaigns, it's all still very much in flux. I mean, one of the things about campaign finance is, in 2004 it was all 527s, and then by 2008, no one was talking about 527s anymore. So, I don't think we know yet what the campaign finance perspective is going to look like for 2016.
Time for one more question.
So you show that people are increasingly sorted now, and that is it because of the existing cross-pressure people are adjusting their ideology or participation, or is it because of the new birth cohort?
Great question, right? So this could be, there's, this is a classic sort of question when you look at aggregate data. Is it that existing people sort of change their views, or is it that new people come into the electorate, right? So that young voters sort of start off in a different place than older voters do. The answer is that it's both. It's hard to say which one is a bigger effect. There's some nice work that Laura Stoker did looking at this sort of long-term panel data that some people started in the 60s that suggests that it seems to be that everyone, for economic issues, it's that everyone kind of moved, that there was this sort of both that new people came in better sorted and older people were sort of changed their positions as well. But for these social issues, it's really that younger people kind of came in a different place than older people did.
Okay, well, one quick announcement. Any of you who might be here for a class, there'll be sign-up sheets out in the lobby out front. Other than that, we also just remember we have a pre-law day on Friday at 2:30. 2 o'clock, sorry, in the Q 518. Thanks. For those of you who are interested, we'll have advisors from or admissions directors from many of the local law schools here, and we'll have panels of people, law professors, talking about the law school experience. So if you're interested in that, join us on Friday. Now, join me now in thanking Matt Levendusky for a very interesting presentation.